Welcome back to MFO, everybody. I appreciate you tuning in. This is On the Water Wednesday, and we are on the James River in Virginia. And today we're going to be talking about tides, tidal fisheries. What do you do when you are fishing a tidal fishery? Tides can be tricky, and there were a lot of times when I thought I'm just gonna fish. I'm not gonna worry about that. You have to pay attention to the tides. We're gonna get you basically a beginner's guide to fishing tides when we come back. Stick around, guys. Welcome back to Mark Fisher Outdoors, everybody. I'm Mark Fisher. Before I get into talking about tides, I just do want to remind you that the registration for our July virtual bass fishing tournament is going on. So if you haven't gotten your money in or gotten your registration in, make sure to email me at mark@markfisheroutdoors.com. You can just let me know you want to get in that. If you need more information, go to last Friday's video and watch the information. All the rules are in the description of that video as well. Hope you get into that. We're going to have a good time. A lot of guys have already signed up. A lot of guys, we're looking at anywhere between 10 and 20 people participating. Remember, everybody gets a prize. All right, let's talk about tides. So basically, when you are looking at fishing a tidal fishery, the couple of key things that you want to keep in mind to start out with is that usually it's the first hour or two leading up to a low tide, and then the hour or two following a low tide. In other words, as the water is draining out of your area and it's becoming low tide, that's a good time. And then as it's filling up, that's a good time. Those are the two peak times. And let's look at why. Low tide is the time that concentrates the fish. With all the water being pulled out of your area, the fish are going to be in the deeper areas because the banks are basically disappearing. So any fish that were up along the bank have to get into, doesn't matter whether it's a deep pocket or a channel or whatever, but they have to move to that deeper water. So concentrating the fish is good for the fishermen. Moving water is good for the fish feeding. It activates that feeding. And so the last hour or two before you get to low tide is a good time. The fish have moved to those concentrated areas, those deeper areas, and they're feeding because the water's moving, which is moving food around and allowing those fish to feed. Now you got that slack tide, and there's kind of a gap in the feeding window. But then as that water starts to fill up, those fish are still in those deeper areas because even though the water's coming in, it hasn't put water on the banks yet. And so those fish are still in those areas feeding. Those are the two prime times to be fishing, okay? So when you're fishing a low tide, things like grass beds and lily pad fields and things like those are good places. If you still have them, those are good places to fish because there's enough water in there to keep the fish there, but you've got, if you're doing things like a frog or a topwater bait, you're right there. The fish aren't that what was deep water, what was maybe 6 or 8 feet of water is now 4 feet of water. And, and again, that's a good time to throw top waters, things like that. The other thing that I have found to be very, very strong is the break. So in other words, if you've got 5 feet of water and it breaks down to 12 feet of water, that on a low tide, they're going to be on that break, on the deeper part of that break. So if you're looking at docks that extend from 5 feet of water out to 12 feet of water, the end of that dock that is now in 12 feet of water on a low tide is a good place to go. They're going to come off of that shallow water and stay in that deeper water during the low tide, and with that water moving, they can position themselves near those dock posts to get out of the current and just sit there and ambush prey and meals that come by as the current's washing in. So docks that go out beyond the break into that deeper water, those are good areas on a low tide as well. Now, the situation that we're in, unfortunately, is that by the time tournament comes around, we're going to be in a situation where our low tide, which, as I've said, is the best time to fish, well, low tide for us during the tournament is going to be about the time that we're eating dinner. So, or driving back to the weigh-in. So we are in a position where a lot of what we're going to have to do, if we're going to do any good in this tournament, is try and find fish during high tide conditions. And to my knowledge, the best way to catch fish during high tide is to try and fish hard cover, whether that be riprap banks, seawalls, docks, things that are vertical cover in the high tide, because the reality is what high tide does is it spreads the fish out. There's still water moving during high tide, but those fish now can go pretty much anywhere. There are fields and fields and fields of lily pads and arrowheads that are out of the water during low tide and then have water all the way up to the tops of them during high tide. Those fish can be anywhere. And obviously, when you've got a low tide situation and little bugs and crayfish and blue crabs and all of those get left high and dry during the low tide, and now what happens is during the high tide, the fish can come in and make an easy meal of those critters that kind of got left high and dry during the low tide. So they will come into what is now the flooded bank and feed. So you definitely want to be able to get to those hard edges. Again, like I said, whether it's riprap or clay banks or seawalls or docks or things like that, because otherwise you're literally looking for a needle in a haystack. The water is flooded everywhere, and the reality of and that's why high tide is so difficult to fish, because they're just spread out. The low tide concentrates them. So that's what we were talking about, guys. During a high tide, you want to fish the hard cover. So there's some cypress trees, and just working a spinner bait, and not a giant, but fish will keep. So high tide and hard cover. Another thing that you hear about guys doing when they're fishing on tidal waters is that they chase the tide. And the reason being for this, or the phenomenon that creates that, is if we know that a low tide is the prime place, prime time to catch fish. Well, if you're fishing, we'll use the James River as an example, where you're starting in Richmond and you're going all the way to Chesapeake Bay. Well, the closer you get to the ocean, the tide moves, it begins closer to the ocean, which means if you're at a low tide at, say, noon, and you're 10 miles from the ocean, if you move towards Richmond, you can keep up with that low tide, meaning you can fish near the ocean, say Chickahominy River, and then move towards Richmond and continue to stay in that low tide cycle, because the tide, it's generally about an hour for every 15 to 20 miles that you travel. So if you spend 20 minutes traveling, you can stay in that low tide for another 40 minutes or so by moving with the tide. So that's another thing that it is important to pay attention to, that you can actually stay in a low tide if you've got areas in different parts of the river. Let's take a look at this tide chart to kind of give an example of that. So you can see on the tide chart that on the Chickahominy Bridge, the low tide at this time versus the low tide at Richmond. And you see how the time is different in one place versus the other. Just a beginner's guide to fishing tidal fisheries. I'm no expert by any means. It's a 14-hour drive for me to get to a tidal fishery, and I do it twice a year, and that's about all the experience I have. But like I said, a beginner's guide to tidal fisheries. We'll see how things go this week. Guys, I appreciate you tuning in, and we will see you again tomorrow for another episode of Mark Fisher Outdoors. Take care, everybody.